This afternoon, our focus is on innovative financing models for climate, because we know that climate is front and center to the development agenda. Richard Payton from EY Parthenon is going to be leading the discussion. And so as we talk about new business models and also climate solutions, let's give an ear to Richard and the panel.
Thank you also to the OPEC Fund for not only the forum, but this panel with my distinguished guests. I know they've been introduced on the screen, so we won't spend time there. But this is definitely a topic that's very close to my heart. We are currently working with the UAE on some innovative financing models that we hope to be able to announce at COP28. And we've heard a lot today about transformation, reforms, and the gap that exists. But for the next 30 minutes, I really want to focus on some solutions. Right, let's actually start thinking about ways in which we can fix the climate finance debate and really address the gap that we've talked about. So without further ado, Warren, let's start with you. How can we start seeing innovative finance in climate finance, and what's really needed here?
Well, I think that we have to start off understanding the scope of the problem and the range of challenges that we have to finance. So this isn't a single issue that we have to figure out how to mobilize money for. It's a whole range of challenges, and for us, for Asian Development Bank in the Asia Pacific, we have not only a range of challenges, but geographically, you know, the Pacific has a completely different set of challenges that are primarily dealing with the impacts of climate change and gaining energy security. They have nothing to do with generating climate emissions. And that's true for most of our developing member countries. We have a few that are high emitters, but most of our countries have generated very little in terms of GHG emissions, but are feeling the impacts of climate change in a major way already. And so we need to be looking at a range of financing mechanisms that meet those conditions at the country level and at the either adaptation or mitigation level. The second thing I think we have to be aware of is that it's not an either or. We have to be focused on scaling up decarbonization in a major way. We have to accelerate investments in decarbonization in every country. Otherwise, we're going to end up spending all of our money in the future on dealing with the impacts of climate change. So, but at the same time, the impacts of climate change are already here. The Pakistan floods last year affected 33 million people, cost the country $15 billion, and many of those poor households are still, they'll suffer for years. That's only going to increase in frequency and intensity. So we're going to be dealing with the impacts of climate change and trying to find ways of paying for that for a long time. The range of mechanisms that we're looking at in ADB are on the decarbonization side, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, are how do you go to scale with closing coal-fired power plants in particular and increasing investments in renewable energy in a hurry. On the broader climate agenda, we just approved and launched what we call an innovative financing facility for climate in Asia and Pacific last month, at our annual meeting last month. And this is a very interesting approach whereby contributors, mainly donor governments, provide a guarantee to ADB, and we use that guarantee to carve out part of our existing loan portfolio, sovereign loan portfolio. These are very low risk loans, which we have less than a 1% default on those kind of loans. By carving that out, for every dollar that we get of a guarantee, we're able to mobilize $4 to $5 in climate finance. So this is the first time that I'm aware of where there's actually a leveraging of the donor contributor to climate finance. So right now we're looking at, this is a pilot, it's an experiment. We hope it works. But we're looking at getting about $3 billion, $4 billion in guarantees. That should mobilize somewhere around $15 to $20 billion in climate finance. This is going to increase the headroom for ADB. We were talking about headroom this morning in some of the discussions. It'll increase our headroom, but it'll also put some it'll ring fence that money for climate finance.
Okay, so lots of topics you brought up there, right? Mitigation, adaptation, innovation, your IFCAP scheme, coal. So we're going to bring in Gernot now. Where are you actually seeing innovation in finance happen on the ground?
Loaded question. Actually, so let me start with this. So I'm an academic, right? So I have the luxury of sort of speaking in abstract terms. Let me try not to do that here. And let me also add, so even though I look like I'm 18 or so, or 20 maybe, my wife makes me wear glasses so I don't get confused with my students. I remember sitting at a panel like this in Copenhagen, 2009, COP. Topic was innovative finance. One of the discussion points was headroom. And it was headroom in carbon emissions, so you can use the headroom developing countries have to grow their emissions further, save some money, spend it on the good stuff. It was COP15. What are we up to by now? 27 and a half, I believe. And we're still, right? Okay, so what gives? Well, here's the very practical. Despite my accent, originally from this country, spent a quarter century now in the US. There is actually a bill or a law on the books. 3 laws when you add them up: Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Chips and Science. Yes, it's about investment in the US, not what the forum is all about. But the positive learning by doing spillovers, even in sort of the most single-minded macroeconomic academic exercise, show that GDP, everywhere where it's measured in this model, goes up as a result of those investments in the US, right? So, okay, US rah-rah? No. But actual $2 trillion being spent over a decade, actual learning by doing spillovers, actual money changing hands, gear put in the ground. Yes, emissions are going up as a result, by the way. Every wind turbine, 100 tons of steel, 150 tons by now, bootstrapping problem, and so on and so forth. But we are actually seeing what you might call the beginnings or the end of the beginning or whatever it might be of this clean energy race on the global level. And at the end of the day, whatever terms we use, whatever mechanism, and they're all fantastic, right? We need the donor countries, ADB, any multilateral development bank, or bilateral institutions to say, and here is how to leverage limited public funds to free. But, well, Copenhagen, it was the $100 billion question. By now we know more, and we are talking about the $100 trillion question in private money, including public funds leveraging that private money. And frankly, the one takeaway is let's get on with it. There is there's plenty of papers for me to write in peer-reviewed journals, and yes, I keep doing that. Of course I will.
Let's
what's the actual next step?
Let's look at that, because I'm like a fellow economist, by training at least. But no, my first ever job was actually in the UK government doing this clean development mechanism for the Kyoto Protocol. So now I'm really showing my age. But no, when you look at the tragedy of the commons and you look at emissions and the social injustice that's happening in the world, because a lot of these effects are being felt by poorer countries, by poorer nations, how are we going to start making sure that that's priced in to finance?
Very quickly. So first of all, of course, it's the poor who suffer. It's the rich who adapt. Every social problem, climate is no different, right? So yes, the question of who pays, of course, is crucial in all of this. And by the way, that for adaptation, right? That's where a massive ramp up of public finance has to be on the table. How do we solve the global commons problem? Well, through cooperation. That's how it works among 3 neighbors trying to figure out where to install the heat pump or the solar panels on the roof of the apartment building. And that's how it works globally. And that's the charge. Get on with it.
Okay, so we're going to throw a bunch of money at adaptation, but particularly in rich countries, right? But how are we going to deal with it? Well, how can the MLDBs help, particularly in the phase out of coal, for example? You mentioned that in your opening statement.
Well, first off, I shared your frustration I've been around a lot longer than you have, and it is frustrating. I think that what I am seeing that's different is and this is partly because of the very painful reality of the impacts of climate change that we're seeing all over the world, and we'll see more frequently. But I think that what is happening is there are some initiatives that are looking at real scale. For the first time, instead of tinkering around the edges, we're looking at scale and hopefully speed. That's still to be determined. So the concept of the JETPs, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the one in South Africa, obviously we're not dealing with, but in Indonesia, Vietnam, and potentially in Pakistan and some other countries in our region, there is real potential to bring partners together, and this is key. No single institution can help any single government to make this transition, but bringing a group of partners together that are ready to say, for example, in Indonesia, there's $20 billion on the table to help you phase out coal. How are we going to do it? There's been a lot of analytical work and working on approaches to this, but there is progress. And I think that the big question in my mind is whether a country like Indonesia continues to be supportive and ready to do this based on the international discussions and based on the commitments of other countries. And so a lot of this is about equity. But the good news is we're seeing things at scale. The energy transition mechanism that we've been working on will retire coal plants very earlier than expected. This could be the biggest reduction of GHGs the world's ever seen if it works. But again, we're at the experimental stage after all these years.
Yeah, and then looking at the economics of that coal phase out, what role can carbon markets? I know you've written a lot about carbon markets, carbon pricing. Should we be giving carbon credits for avoidance?
Yes.
Okay, and how should we price them?
Fairly.
And what would be a fair price?
Social cost of carbon, $200+ per ton of CO2.
So that's significantly above any rate that we see in the market today?
Yep.
Okay. And when we have a price of carbon at that level, what technologies then become available to us to help decarbonize faster?
Turns out we don't even need a carbon price. 210 coal plants in the US, for 209 of them, it pays today to shut it down, replace with a local renewable generation capacity, emphasis on local because, well, grid is complicated and so on and so forth. Literally spend the money on the full transition, right? Capital expenditures plus OPEX, operating expenditure for the renewable, less than operating expenditures alone for those coal plants. All right, so the economics point in one and only one direction. And by the way, that one plant where it doesn't pay, literally a coal plant in Wyoming, literally right next to the mine, and so on and so forth, right? So, okay, this is a US story. And yes, ADB is doing amazing work trying to make that work in Indonesia and so on and so forth. And yes, of course, that's exactly, now, in this case, by the way, right, it's regulation, if you will, standing in the way of the transition. So, right, this is not just one-sided politically, oh yeah, of course, it's the ones over there that want it and we, the reasonable people, don't. Not at all. While at the same time, of course, right, back to carbon pricing, which, by the way, to me is, anything is a carbon price that pushes toward, right? All we have in economics is relative prices, that's what matters. Well, solar PV, cheapest form of electricity in history. Yes, it went up last year by 20% or so. Guess what? Fossils went up by even more. So even last year, solar PV is cheaper than the year before, although the absolute price went up. Relatively speaking, solar PV is cheaper last year than it had ever been. In any year, the last, right? 40 years ago, when Jimmy Carter put the solar panels on the White House roof, 5 years later, Ronald Reagan took them down. Nobody's taking down solar panels anymore because it is the cheapest form of electricity in history.
But then when it's the cheapest form of electricity, you don't get additionality, so therefore you don't get carbon credits when you utilize a solar plant. So, but
You don't need them because it's the cheapest form of electricity in history.
but there are clearly other market failures at play if the economics point to 204 plants closing down.
Of course.
Then we need to fix that.
Look, I'm not an economist, and I'm not disagreeing with the economics of this, but when I was at the World Bank, I ran our carbon finance operations. It was about $2.5 billion, and the price was not near the social cost of carbon, not anywhere near, but it did have an impact. And so I think certainly, I would love to see the social price of carbon be the price of carbon, but right now we don't have anything that's really solid. And so I would love to see the discussion, the political discussions in the COP, get the Article 6 arrangements all done, and I think we will see an impact from a new, reasonably solid, sustainable carbon market. And hopefully over time we'll get a decent price out of it. So not being an economist, I just look at what makes things happen, and I think this is still a very important part of the equation.
No, I think that's right, and especially when you're looking at the north-south, the global north and the global south, you've got a lot of sovereign debt problems in the global south. There's not a lot of fiscal headroom, so there needs to be something else in that mechanism to help it. Tell us a little bit more, Warren, just about the IFCAP, because it has been a success, I think, your pilot.
Well, we stole the idea from the education sector, actually. There's a new initiative called IFID, and the idea is basically that guarantees from, in most cases it'll be donor countries, but it could be philanthropies, it could be others, that guarantees, they put a guarantee into ADB, let's say $1 billion. That allows us to take about, we have what we call a synthetic portfolio of existing loans that we then take off of our books. By taking a billion, having $1 billion, we can take $4 billion, $5 billion worth of loans off of our books. These are sovereign guaranteed loans, which means that in reality, the donor's gonna get their $1 billion back. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. And so that's how we basically can leverage the guarantees to get more climate finance. The problem is, and this is something that before we run out of time, I want to emphasize, almost every initiative that we're looking at these days, and Gernot, you mentioned this earlier, the reality is that we're running into trouble, and perhaps the most significant of my career, the difficulty of mobilizing concessional and grant finance, which is critical for the climate resilience, climate adaptation agenda. And so I think I'm much less worried about mobilizing the financing for the mitigation side. I'm much more concerned about where the money's gonna come from required to actually help countries overcome the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're already doing innovative finance, so that's great. Gernot, just any last comments from you? How do you see the next 12 months? What's the one thing you'd like to see innovative that can be done in the next 12 months that will help climate change?
Well, 12 months is a fairly tight timeline. Let's start with that. I've no doubt we'll be sitting on panels like this several times between now and then. Actually, so here's maybe the US-centric view again. It has now taken almost 10 months by now, right? So Inflation Reduction Act passed on August 16th to sort of everybody's surprise, right? This is sort of the, wow, good news. Very little money has changed hands because it takes Treasury is writing the rules, and we don't yet know what qualifies for green hydrogen, and sort of tiny little decisions will make the difference between basically hydrogen, which we can all be excited about, turning into the next corn ethanol, $600 billion of annual subsidies, and emissions increase as a result. Now, those subsidies are never going to go away because, well, corn dogs are delicious and presidential primaries start in Iowa. But that has nothing to do with climate agenda, and now tiny little decisions. Very few of us would ever care to know what those are, other than, frankly, the lobbyists on one end and what's often called environmentalists on the other, what I would say facts, science on the other. How these rules are written that will determine whether those Inflation Reduction Act subsidies will in fact lead to decreases in emissions, a race to the top globally in terms of clean energy, and a race down in terms of emissions, as opposed to, frankly, right, locking in yet another energy boondoggle in the name of doing something about climate. And I guess what I would watch out for, it's precisely these tiny little decisions that seem insignificant and make all the difference, because, well, this is a race. It hopefully is a race to the top overall, in the positive sense of the term. And we don't have much more time to experiment to get it wrong.
Innovative finance at speed. I will sum it up for you.
Scale and speed,
Okay.
as Warren
I
mentioned.
think our time is up. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It was a pleasure to host you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.